the adoption curve is basically the idea that when you have any new thing, it follows a normal distribution. So you have about 5% of people, they're called the innovators. So they will immediately adopt a new thing. They'll be open, they'll say, yes, we're going to try this. You know, they're the ones who line up to buy the latest doodad at the technology store before anybody has even confirmed the darn thing works, you know? They just, it's shiny, want that. There's a great openness to it. And so that's about 5%. Then you've got about 10%. So the first 5%, they're called innovators. There are different terms for these, but I'm using some common ones. The next 10% are the early adopters. So the early adopters, they're not experimentalists. They're not, you know, willing to try it without even knowing it works. They hear that it works. They're comfortable adopting it. They're not waiting around to see what everybody else is doing, but they want some minimal evidence that the thing works. So that's the early adopters. Then you have about 35%. That's called the early majority. So the early majority, these are people who aren't waiting to see what everybody else is doing, but they want some systematic proof that this is at least useful. So they wait to see what the early adopters are doing. If the early adopters drop out, they say, no, this is garbage, then they don't bother following. They don't want to take the risk. They're more risk averse. But they still have a fair degree of openness. Then you have the late majority. The late majority are the ones who say, well, everybody else is doing it. I guess we might as well. You know, so they'll upgrade because, you know, it's time, and the thing is basically proven its worth. So why not? So that's also about 35%. Then after the late majority, you have this broad category, 15%, called the laggards. I actually divide the laggards in two. There's a 10% division, which is the true laggards. They're the ones who say, fine, you know, everybody else might be doing it. I'm not doing it. Not until I'm forced to do it. So that's the ones who, you know, they're going to keep using the old version of Windows until they get a message that says, we are no longer supporting Windows. You're going to be infected with viruses unless you upgrade. You know, a friend of mine, she had an old flip phone, and she kept getting calls from the phone company, the mobile company, saying, we're not going to be supporting your phone anymore. You have to think about upgrading your phone. It's an old model. The system won't support it anymore. Well, do you still support it? Yeah, I'm fine. So she got another call months later. Look, we're on the edge of shutting it down. We have all these different phones you could buy. Like, why not just get one of these? You know, I'm okay. And then finally, one day she got a box in the mail with a note saying, we have your old phone is no longer supported by our network. Here's a new one for free. Because they knew they'd lose her as a customer otherwise, right? Now, it was the absolute base model of phone. It didn't have all kinds of fancy bells and whistles. But like, she's pretty classic, you know, for being in this category. Not aggressive, but just sort of, I'm fine. I don't see why I have to go with this crowd. And then finally, you have the other 5% of the laggards. These are the ones who will actively oppose. They're the ones who will go on social media and say, I can't believe that my mobile phone network doesn't support my phone anymore. It's worked fine for years. Why do we have to change? You know, they sent me this thing in the box. I threw it in the garbage. You know, that kind of thing. So kind of a violent and unreasonable reaction. To some degree, the innovators are unreasonable too. They're not waiting for evidence. They just want it. These are degrees of reasonableness and openness and risk-taking. So to get back to your question about how do we convince priests or bishops? The simple truth is priests and bishops are also on this curve. Some of us are innovators, early adopters, early majority people. You know, where do you think Father James Mallon is, right, with his whole program of divine renovation? Well, he's clearly on the left end of this scale, right? He's let's try it. If it doesn't work, well, we'll try something else. I mean, the number of initiatives that he started before divine renovation really became the thing is quite exceptional. You know, he used to have an initiative called dogmatic theology, which had to do with dogs. You ever heard about that? No, most people haven't heard about it, but it was an initial attempt. Good for him, you know, he was trying stuff. We have some of our clergy who are more on the other end. They'll say, okay, well, we've got this thing the bishop wants us to do, and yeah, we'll do it, but you know, we've had so many programs in the diocese before that started with enthusiasm and then just petered out. I'm going to wait and see how this works before we actually get on board. They don't have ill will. They just don't have the same degree of early adopter enthusiasm. There is always a core that says, you know what? 5%, we should never have stopped having the Mass in Latin. We should never, Vatican II was totally wrong. We're going to work, not just grumble about it, we're going to oppose it, we're going to undermine it. It's not reasonable, honestly, to think that 2,000 bishops gathered together for 4 years of prayer and discernment, somehow voting 95% in favor of things, got it wrong. Like, if you really believe that, then you don't believe the Holy Spirit has any practical effect in the life of the church. Like, that doesn't make sense. But again, it may be because they're reacting to other modes of adoption that occurred that weren't according to what Vatican II asked for. Maybe it's a personality quirk, who knows? So that's why I always try and stick to the documents. I try and say, okay, what does the church actually say, as opposed to what everybody else is saying it says? That's usually a pretty good reflex. So if your question is, how do we get our priest who is in this category to be in this category? The answer is, you will never. Because it's usually related to dimensions of personality. Some people have a dimension called openness to experience, others don't. If you're saying, how can we get our priest to be different from what he is? I guess pray. But complaining and cajoling certainly is not going to go anywhere. It'll have the opposite effect. If you really want to do an initiative that you see as positive and you feel that it requires the support of a priest or a bishop, well, particularly a priest, because usually these things start in parishes, find the one where this is happening. Like in Ottawa, Companions of the Cross got started, right, with Father Bob Bedard, and Bob Bedard had an experience of conversion. He was a high school teacher and had a profound experience of conversion, life in the Spirit, and gathered a small group of men who prayed together and studied together, and suddenly they realized we're turning into a religious order of sorts, and because we want to live a life of common mission. And in St. Mary's, which was your typical parish inner city, suddenly came alive because there was an early adoption of stuff, you know. Could have gone another way, who knows? But that's kind of how it all got started. And so why did so many groups of the renewal scattered across Ottawa suddenly have the St. Mary's as a focal point? Because it was an easy place to do it, easy place to get started. So my suggestion is try and find the place, and then once the presence in the parish is a settled presence, in other words, once the parishioners themselves, it becomes part of the culture and life of the parish. In other words, people have gone from going, oh, this is a new thing, I don't know, to, oh yeah, it's been going on, or oh, it's been going on for 20 years and it's fine. You know, we'll find there's a greater acceptance across the board. And if the renewal and Life in the Spirit seminars and other things really are bringing fruit, then eventually other people are going to say, how come we don't have that in our parish? That's usually, I've found, how these things go. I have found, though, the error that comes from people who are enthusiastic about a program, who are in this category is to approach people in this category and say, we have this great new thing, and we have to be doing it, and you have to be doing it with us. That's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for resistance. It's not going to work because it goes counter to human nature. And part of the reason I show you this curve is because when we're in one of these categories, sometimes we don't realize we are. We don't realize that other people are different, and that's okay. We just need to know how to interact with people who are different from ours. So I show you this to help us all develop a common language.